Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Modern Maze. I am very delighted to have our next guest on this podcast, which is Caroline from the amazing organization of Regen Melbourne. Caroline, how are you going today?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me.
I guess just to give everyone some context, could you maybe describe your career journey so far and what is it you do in Regen Melbourne today?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I'm one of those people that hasn't really followed a conventional path. But yeah, I would say I studied a lot around anthropology, international development, but then also was very keen to also engage in the world of business and the economy and understand how the two come together. So have very much been someone who always has liked to hold both those worlds rather than having to choose. And so fast forward, I've worked in organizational development, and that was really understanding mostly organizational culture and people and how do we actually develop, in our work and in our roles and as a team. And from there fell into social enterprise and really looked at how do you actually leverage social enterprise as a model to help get great ideas into the world, but also help them be sustainable and, endure the test of time whilst serving local needs. Have really sat in those disciplines of kind of business and particularly entrepreneurship and kind of lean approaches to getting ideas off the ground, but very strongly sat in those kind of anthropological ethnographic roots, and just fell into the world of service design, really, and using, human-centered design and now planet-centered and country-centered approaches. And I suppose, with all of those skills, I've worked in a few different places. I've worked in agencies, I've worked in bigger not-for-profits, have worked in startup, and in moments of transition, just after COVID, when everyone was finding their feet again, landed in Regen. And so I landed in a project called Participatory Melbourne, which was really starting collaboration. I'm trying to see how I could engage with the great work that Regen was doing and bring all of my different backgrounds into navigating quite an important but also complex topic, I suppose, of participation and what does that look like for a city, not just at the individual level, but then how do we help individuals understand how they can participate and how they can be involved and how they can understand how and why they want to contribute to a place. And now that has evolved, and I'm the lead for our urban governance work in the systems lab. And yeah, that's kind of a very fast track journey of where I've been. I work in the university on the side as well, Monash Uni. And so, sometimes feed some of those things in, but I would say where my head is at right now is definitely looking at how do we collaborate, how do we engage collectively to make decisions and create change in our places.
Wow. Well, that's quite a journey you've had there.
Yeah. I
think, it's really interesting what you said about participation. And I did sort of a poll for the end of the year. So I really wanted to understand from my listeners how they were feeling about the world and, how did 2024 land for them? What was their lived experience? And something that I asked them was, do you think you can change the world? And I just had 3 responses to choose from, which was yes, no, and unsure. And the vast majority was unsure. And I think to me, that really spells, at least in my circle and the people that I come across, is that people want to participate, but they're not sure where to start, or they're not sure what the first step in that is, or what does it look like, what time is it at, where is it? And so, I guess I'm just curious as to where did you and Regen Melbourne land on participation being such a big focus across all of your work? And yeah, what makes it so powerful in driving this sort of work and change?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question.
Jeez.
Very cleverly worded poll question. I think on that first point around participation, I think it's actually really nice to reflect back to where our work as Regen started, in that the work really came out of the dual crisis that we were facing here. We had bushfires happening in our state whilst COVID was also happening. And what's really interesting about that is that it was really demonstrating both the social fractures, but also our struggles with climate and some of the challenges that we were facing at the same time. And I think in that moment, what we saw was both a recognition of the transition that maybe we need to make, but also that things are clearly not working because there's fractures in multiple realms, not just, one or two. And so if I think of participation, I think what it also showed us was that a lot of people felt a bit helpless and like they couldn't do anything because not only were they limited in terms of this natural phenomenon that was happening in their environments, but they were also feeling really challenged by what it meant to be socially isolated as a whole place, not just as individuals in society, because, social isolation isn't something new. It's been existing in certain pockets for a really long time. And, different people's lived experiences, we may have different engagements with that. But in that moment, actually, we were all facing that together in quite an intense way, like not being able to go more than 5 kilometers, like that's really big. And so I think what it really surfaced was that not only is participation important, I think we started to realize that. I think we started to realize the importance of particularly contributing and participating in our place, in our places, in our communities. And I'll use the term community quite broadly there, just because conscious that lots of people are connected to lots of communities. But in this instance, it was both the people living around you, but then your family and, your loved ones around you, and maybe not having that sense of community that actually supports you, but then also things like sport and recreation and the things that you do out of your home and out of where you might live that also help you build connection and help you feel like you're engaging in something. So I think there's something in that really surfaced. And as things have developed, we've obviously also recognised that, coming back to the donut, our Melbourne donut that we've worked on, the city portrait, it's very clear that there are a lot of elements in that social foundations layer which are not being served. And a lot of that comes back to impacting your ability to participate, let alone you then feeling like you actually are empowered to contribute and have something to contribute. And so I think, there's some really interesting threads in that work. And so, Participatory Melbourne was essentially looking at, we've had all of this stuff happening and all of these complexities, both social and environmental and philosophical and ideological. I'm not even going to mention politics in this conversation, but all of those things contribute to what it means to participate. And I think you're right when you say, I think people felt lost and feel lost because there isn't a clear sense of what it means to participate anymore. And I think our ability to participate has really been tested. So that was like a bit of a long answer, but I feel like they're some of the germinations. And so really the project started last year in actually looking at, what does participation look like? Where are there examples where participation is really strong? What are the mechanisms that are in place to support participation at different levels? I particularly started to diving into thinking about, how does this connect to our evolution as humans? So I started to look at, models of human development and how we actually understand and develop as individuals in a system and then become part of a community or a network or a system? And then what does that look like in supporting us to actually contribute? Because obviously when we're a baby, we are absorbing, we share love, and, that's about it. And so I think that really also helped to understand what are the different ways that we need to look at ourselves in order to understand how we can engage and understand what we need to contribute. And so I think it leads us to a really interesting question of what does it mean to holistically contribute to your place, to your community, but also understand your potential in that contribution? And coming back to your poll, I think that's a really interesting question to ask, almost when you get those unsures, it'd be like, well, do you understand your potential? Are you able to articulate what you have to give, to offer, to share? And then do you feel able to do that? And if you don't feel able to do that, what is getting in the way for you? Is it the mechanisms? Is it the system? Is it the confidence in yourself? Is it an understanding of what you're actually able to do? Or is it something completely different? And so I think that's a really interesting then stepping stone to actually start exploring this question. And so we did that in lots of different ways and tested lots of different approaches, everything from small workshops to citizens' assemblies to design forums, to kind of navigate what that could look like for people and what are the different ways that can really support that understanding of participation to then be able to actually actively participate.
When you were doing these workshops and I guess getting input from people in different communities, were there any standout, I guess, not answers, but any standout themes that came out over the barriers to participation? Was there anything that, kind of stuck out?
Yes, there were. So we actually, towards the end of last year, we actually brought all of our insights into a report, which both spoke about potential pathways, but also spoke about barriers and enablers to participation more specifically. And it's really interesting because some of them are really obvious, but then some of them you're like, oh, okay, I wouldn't have necessarily suggested that that's exactly what would have been the kind of most prominent or emerging trend. So I think how we thought about it was, what are the enabling versus constraining forces for participation? Not just to understand them, but to us, it actually identified where the work is and what needs to happen. And so rather than just looking at one or the other, we were like, well, what's the balance there? And so in terms of enabling, one of the things that we played with was this concept of abundance. So when there is a sense of abundance, not just in terms of having lots of things, but in terms of feeling abundant, in terms of your personal situations, in terms of what you have to offer, in terms of what you have access to, that really unlocks participation because you're not being limited or having that scarcity mindset of, I don't have enough resources, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough money. And so that was a really interesting comparison piece to draw out. And so what would it look like if we engaged in a place of abundance is a really nice place to start from, recognizing that not everyone has that, but it's a really interesting provocation when you're starting to think of different futures. I think another really, particularly, because obviously this is in the context of Greater Melbourne, and so particularly in a place like Melbourne, there's a real pride of place, which is a really interesting enabling force. But also, if you aren't connected to that feeling, that sense of collective belonging, that can feel really disconnecting and really isolating, both in terms of disconnection from people, but also disconnection from place, from the commons, from somewhere where you feel like you can be and connect to. So that's kind of another one. A very big one, which we're experiencing a lot, is that mistrust in the political and economic system. It's a really big constraining force, and there's so much data out there that is showing that more and more. So one of the indexes that we have been looking at really closely, given the work we're doing, is the Scanlon Social Cohesion Index. And so every year they've been releasing that. And it's been really interesting because that mistrust in the government and the economic system is increasing all the time. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's quite alarming. And that impacts your ability and your willingness to want to participate in a system that you don't trust. And beyond that, what we were kind of really seeing quite strongly is a system that doesn't represent your voice and isn't actually putting forward what you feel, what you experience day to day. So that's a really kind of big one. Then there's the ones that we have known about for a really long time. And I think, operating in the kind of systems that we do in a Western country is the growing power differentials. Equity, status, access to resource is obviously a really big constraining force. And so for us, what we've been trying to look at is, well, from an enabling perspective, how can we connect more to the power and the agency that comes from community and collective action? Because whilst those differentials exist, there is a real strength and agency in acting collectively and having a collective voice and then being able to act on that voice. I think what's really interesting is we talk about imagination and new ideas a lot, but I would say another one that we've been seeing, and I think it's been really prominent in a lot of the workshops and the sessions we've been running, is actually a bit of a crisis of imagination. Is because of all of the things that are being imposed on us, some people are really struggling to actually think of different futures. And so in sessions, we often have to push people to actually think about, okay, so there are some ideas there, but they all still seem constrained within the current system or what is possible right now. How do we actually push you beyond that to think about what is possible and even further, like what is probable without the constraints of today? And I think that's something that we've really been leaning into, particularly as we've transitioned into exploring urban governance. Understanding that participation is a part of that, but our governing systems actually impact, the ability to participate, and the different levels and layers of governance really have a role in that. And so I think imagination is one of the really important, both enablers, but also constraints, depending on how comfortable or how able you feel to imagine beyond what already exists. I would say the last one, which I'm sure is something that has come up a few times for you, is technology. Both an enabler in the sense that there's a lot of potential, but also a very big constraint in terms of, all of the risks and all of the challenges, and particularly if you think of like the role of social media, how that's really changed a lot of things and made participation in some senses actually really difficult and sometimes dangerous. But on the other side, in difficult times, how it's really connected us. So I would say that's the suite of constraints and forces. And I think moving into this year and kind of working through sense-making all of the things that we heard, we really decided that based on what we were hearing and coming back to where the work is, we really felt that honing in on that pride of place and exploring place-based solutions, looking at what new democratic innovations could actually help us tackle some of this lack of trust between communities and institutions in particular, and then really looking at what does community and collective action look like, and particularly what does that look like in terms of new ways of being and doing and different knowledge systems that might actually support us to navigate through, being able to do these things in a different way collectively, what might that facilitate for us? And so that's kind of where we've landed and what we've been looking at this year in that evolution of the work.
That's really, really interesting. I loved what you said about abundance within yourself, not just material things, but that being an enabling factor to participation makes a lot of sense to me, and is maybe not something that we would consciously think of when we're first thinking about participation. In terms of community, I'm just wondering, because we had a workshop last week that I attended, and you posed a question about, what is your community? What community do you identify yourself with? And my answer was kind of, I don't feel like I have just one community that I identify with. And I'm just thinking, in today's times, you have so many different communities that you can be a part of, whereas back in the day it was your village, your tribe, and that's it, your family. Whereas now, you'll have communities overseas, you'll have it at work, you'll have it at, sports club, and especially with, a lot more immigration and first generation, second generation Australians coming in that may be uprooted from their families. I know for me, when we moved to Australia, I was 13 and it was only my mom, my dad, my brother and me, and that was it. So the sense of community had to be rebuilt into something new in a new place. And I was just curious about, I guess, the fact that Melbourne's growing, the demographics are shifting and there's more people coming in. And if there was anything that came up around that, I guess the fluid nature of modern communities and how do we root ourselves in that in today's times?
Yeah. Yes. That is a great question. And it did come up in lots of different ways. And it's really interesting because my parents are migrants as well. And so I was born in Australia, but I definitely grew up in a very Latino household. And so it was almost like as soon as I stepped out of the house, it was a very different place to be in. And I was lucky that I felt comfortable to adapt in those worlds. And for me, that's something that I've really held on to and really appreciated. But there are some people that find that really difficult and that maybe don't land in a place where they have that easy movement and, that understanding that there are the two worlds that you're navigating and you're being supported to do that. Earlier this year, we were actually grappling with this, and I was having a great conversation with one of our collaborators about this idea of transitioning to a new place. And often we talk about the challenges that, lots of people face in terms of migrating and moving to different cities or different suburbs. But actually, it's a really interesting thing to think about because also as a society, we also move around a lot. So we don't live in the home that we have lived in, since we were a kid. I've lived in about 15 different homes in my life. And that is actually the norm. But what's happened is we haven't actually thought about what it means and how do we actually approach finding that belonging in a new place. And how do we tap into that existing community that is there while still holding on to different other communities that we've had that have served us in different ways that may not be able to as readily transition as us physically. And so we were trying to shake up how we ran things. And so earlier this year, we held a bit of like a generative dinner with practitioners looking at participation and participatory design, but also the role of things like belonging or narrative and storytelling in creating a sense of belonging. And then people who are working in community organisations trying to navigate this for different communities. And we essentially held this dinner as a way to facilitate a different conversation that was less about like, let's workshop this and think of solutions to let's actually be together and understand the different paths that have gotten us here and then sit with some of these interesting questions over a meal, bringing abundance, bringing generosity, being together and exploring these questions from all of our different lived experiences or all of our different work in a slightly different way. And so what was really interesting was the 3 areas that we were looking at in that conversation were the role of narrative in actually supporting transition and finding a sense of place or belonging. Then actually, what does belonging look like in all of its different forms, and how do you build that either from zero or how do you deepen that? And we were also looking at how do you then find new and different ways of being in a place, what do possible futures look like from those different vantage points, a newly arrived person even to a place. So good example, I live in the Dandenongs right now. And when we first got here, I'm not from Melbourne, let alone from the Dandenongs. There was no orientation. There was no way of understanding what it means to live in the hills. We had a friend who lived here, but that was it. And so even those moments is how do you build that sense of belonging in these modern times? What does it look like to find those modern examples of, I suppose, roles or in that workshop that you referenced, we talked about archetypes. What are the different archetypes that need to exist in a community to actually support things like belonging or transitioning or identifying how someone can contribute? And so I think, a lot of the work that we've been looking at is finding both existing examples of how these things are happening, but also some of these gaps that we're seeing and what might be able to be used to fill those.
Just jumping into imagination, because that's something that really interests me as well. And you were mentioning the importance of narratives and narratives being a focus in the work that you're leading now in, what's it called? New urban governance. Urban governance. Just imagination. What you were saying before about the role of imagination and how it diminishes, it has become, is so resonant to me, because even me being really interested in this work and exploring it, I would often find myself hitting a brick wall when I thought about, okay, how is this actually going to work? What does the future look like? And to me, that really leans into I'm referring back to the questions that I asked my followers, which was, how are you going to participate? How do you think you can change the world? And, being unsure of that, I'm sure leans into the imagination. If you're not sure that you can make a difference and how to make a difference, then that limits your imagination on what a future looks like. And so I guess, could you explain, thinking about imagination, how does that play into the narratives and the stories that we tell ourselves, and what is the importance of these stories when trying to design a new, urban governance framework or sustainable living? What is the importance of that?
Yeah, really interesting question. So I think what's really interesting about storytelling. Oh, I've lost you. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry, I lost you for a second.
That's all right.
What's really interesting about storytelling and the power of storytelling is that it's actually a really helpful way for us to understand our different experiences and different perspectives and have a conversation about them. Because stories are things that you've experienced. And so you're not thinking about something that hasn't happened yet. You're thinking about something that has happened to you and that you've lived through and that you can connect with and resonate with. And when you share a story and someone else can resonate with that story, it builds a little bridge that maybe didn't exist before, because you're not just talking about things that you know or things that you've learned conceptually. You're talking about things that you have felt and that you've experienced. And so you can connect both in terms of the feeling of that, as well as the experience and the conversations and the intellect that, comes into those experiences as well. So I think it's a really interesting tool, and it's a tool that's been used by First Nations communities for a really long time because it travels through time. It's something that, even though it changes and morphs and molds, it is something that holds relevance and that stays with people much longer than a stat or a data point does. And so I think there's that kind of element of understanding storytelling, but then also recognizing that, I'm going to get technical here, but when we talk about narratives are collections of stories. And so I think sometimes we blend the two in terms of the language we use. But if we want to get technical, a narrative is that collection of stories. And what narratives do really well is they express certain beliefs, values, ideologies, because the collection is actually forming a certain direction or shared purpose that those stories alone don't necessarily hold. And so if we think about new urban governance, if we are able to not only tell the stories that help us, that guide us, that empower us, that inspire us, but also start to understand how they come together to create this shared understanding of what we value and what we appreciate, but also the things that we want to see in our futures, it unlocks a different conversation than just purely, riffing off the top of your head the things that you would like or not like or that you're challenged by, right? And I think it plays a really important role, not just in actually telling of the stories, but actually sometimes reframing or reclaiming the narratives that maybe have been imposed on us. And so I think that's a really crucial bit in this time, because we live in certain systems that have been imposing certain narratives on us as individuals, but also as communities, as a society, for a really long time. And I think there's a really interesting transition that we can start making in terms of actually recognizing, again, our power, our collective agency, what we want to see in the world, and actually use narrative as a way to push against some of those things that we don't accept or that do not feel like the lived experience that we have or that we want to have going forward. So I think narrative is helpful in terms of its core function of being able to share stories that help understand beliefs, cultures, ideologies, but also plays a really important role in terms of the actual act of creating narratives and or reframing or reclaiming narratives. And there's a really beautiful process of building agency and empowerment in that process in and of itself, which is something that we're really interested in as we're looking in new urban governance, because we actually both see it as a tool or a mechanism as well as a really interesting outcome, because the stories are also then helpful to inspire others and allow us to then start to explore what are the existing narratives, as well as supporting people to move through change using narrative as a way to kind of navigate.
Yeah, coming from a place of something that you felt in your body and that resonates with you, and something that's affected you personally would have more weight than, for example, if I just read statistics of ChatGPT or and I think to me that's another thing about participation and even communities is the information age is, we were talking about technology, but it's overwhelming. And my sense is that sometimes I've gotten into rabbit holes, especially since I started this podcast, right? Like I'll look up a topic and I'll go way too deep into it, and I'll feel terrible about the world. I'll feel, pessimistic, and I'll carry this energy, but there's actually a disconnect between what I've experienced versus what I'm just reading and what I'm consuming. And so I think it's really interesting that you talk about, the power of narratives and stories being that is the actual lived experience of each of us and a community, and sort of raising that up and using that to drive decisions. I just had Emma from Sweltering Cities on the show a few weeks ago, and that's a big thing that they do, is lifting up the stories of people that have lived through, heat wave conditions and are suffering, and using that to drive, advocacy and try and make change. So really, stories, we've been telling stories for as long as we've been around, and they stand the test of time.
Yeah.
Yes.
They really do. And I think on that point, if I can share an example that is feeling really pertinent right now, I think we're in a really interesting moment of both as individuals, but also as collections of individuals, because essentially that's what a community is. We're at this interesting point of being able to recognize that there have been some narratives that have been set upon us that we now have the opportunity to evolve from. And so there's been some really cool work done by people like John Alexander and Baratunde Thurston around this idea to citizen. And I think that term maybe is problematic.
To citizen?
To citizen.
To citizen. Sorry, continue.
As a verb.
Okay.
Yeah. How do we understand that as a verb? And I think we struggle a little bit in Australia with that, because obviously not everyone is a citizen, and citizenship is quite a colonial thing as well. But if we remove that and we think about what does it mean to be of a place and to be active in that place for a really long time, to be someone who lives in a place or in a city or is a citizen, if we use their language, was to be a subject and was to be told what to do. We then evolved into this place of, okay, well, maybe you can have more autonomy and you have more to say, but that just then evolved to being a consumer. If we think about, really where we are now, and I don't just mean consumer in terms of buying things, I mean consumer in terms of here are the options that you have to choose from. Whereas where we're now moving to is, well, I think where we're moving now to is, and a lot of people I think would agree, is actually we want to have an active say in not just what the menu is, but what's on the menu and what kind of menu it is and what influences that menu beyond just a group of people who are representing us. And so I think it's a really interesting movement into, if we want to use the term active participation, that's really what it looks like. And so it's not just about choosing from a selection. It's actually being the ones who are putting forward the selection and saying, based on our lived experience, based on what's happening in our places, this is what is important to us, and here is a decision that we need to make together. And finding ways to both do that, but also finding ways to then make those decisions a reality. And so I think that's a really interesting reframe of a narrative of I am, someone who's told what to do. I'm someone who consumes to I'm someone who decides.
That's a big shift.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's powerful because, when you were talking about self-imposed narratives, the first example that came into my mind was from Donut Economics, the Homo economist, and that's the rational economic figure that we've all, that's been our part in society, that's the role that we play. And that is the narrative that's been pushed onto us. And it's so much more than just buying things. It's a whole way of being. It's what is the lifestyle to support that, and what are all the systems in there. Are there any other imposed narratives on modern society that are jumping out to you through your work?
Well, I'll talk about some that have popped up, and then maybe also talk about some that have been more recent in the sessions that we did the other day, because I think it was really interesting to see that emerge. There are some that are very Australia specific, because I think it's really helpful to have lots of global examples. But I also think sometimes we forget to then think about, well, but what does that mean for where we are and our place? And so one of the ones that I've actually been grappling with, and we've been having quite a few conversations around, is this concept of a fair go. I don't know if you know the term, like it's fair go and the whole land of opportunity thing. And I think it's a really interesting one because I think the concept is actually like a appealing concept. You know, everyone should have an equal opportunity. Everyone should have a chance to be the best version of themselves they can be. The reality of that in Australia is that not everyone has had or is having a fair go. And actually the concept of a fair go, you know, if you go into some of the roots of it, and I'm not an expert on this, so sorry if I've said something wrong, but what I have understood of it is if you work hard, you will get the outcome. And there are a lot of people in our society who are working really hard and who are devoting themselves, and they are not getting the same outcomes as others. And the opportunity isn't there. And there's so many statistics showing the difference in equality and actually how that inequality is growing. And so I think that's a really interesting one where we've seen through conversations that things like that are not landing with people anymore. But also there's been research shown, again, if I reference the Scanlon Index, they look at, you know, they actually looked at fair go in 2023 as one of the questions and one of the measures. And it was really interesting to read, you know, some of the elements of that it wasn't resonating with people anymore and that they actually didn't feel like that was something that applied to them in their situation and that demonstrated their ambitions, let alone what they were experiencing. And I think it's a really interesting kind of thing to explore when we also then think about some of the things we're experiencing in Australia at the moment and around the world around like cost of living crises. And if you think about, you know, in a lot of places, the dream is have a home, have kids, have a dog, you know, that is what good looks like. But for a lot of people, that isn't achievable, but also might not be their dream. Some people don't want to have kids. Some people don't want to have a set home where they have to stay. They want to be traveling the world. They want to be having different experiences. And then there's another cohort of people who that is not attainable and actually, you know, basically setting like they're the rites of passage in our society is actually really detrimental in some instances and really narrowing of our potential.
And our imagination.
Which, you know, kind of gets me. And our imagination, exactly. I was about to say, which circles us back to imagination and like our potential to contribute, you know, to our place. So yeah, and I think, you know, even last week, some of the things that came up in those sessions were really interesting around even some of the narratives of everything has to be moving constantly and pace is something that is being imposed, particularly on Western societies, quite a lot. And actually taking the moment to experience and to connect with your emotions rather than just being production machines is actually something that quite a few people mentioned that they were grappling with. And actually, you know, one of the participants spoke about bringing together a cohort of people who intentionally wanted to slow down and take time to experience and to engage with their emotions and how they're feeling about things and take a minute, rather than just going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. So yeah, it's quite an interesting spectrum that you can look at in terms of some of those narratives. And I think, yeah, it can play a really interesting role in both being aware of what might be getting in the way, which, you know, to your comment earlier around your listeners saying they're unsure. Well, perhaps it's because there's so many narratives being imposed that they're not really sure which ones they believe in anymore or which ones actually feel true or not, or maybe they don't resonate at all. And if you're in a place where everything you're hearing is good, in inverted commas, doesn't resonate, well, of course you're going to feel unsure because you're not going to feel like there is a path that feels right for you, and maybe there's something wrong with you, and maybe you're not seeing the world in the same way as everyone else, when really all of these things are myths that have been created over time to help us through certain moments. And I think we've just had a really long period of not challenging them.
Yeah, the menus remain unchanged for a while. It's like when you go to a restaurant and they've had the same menu for 5-10 years, but it's in decades for us at this point. Yeah. it's like I never considered Melbourne to be like a hustle city and like the rush of the lifestyle there. I don't know. I thought I had a pretty relaxed life until I quit my job and started traveling. And I said, oh, wow, the pace at which Melbourne goes is actually pretty intensely fast. You hear about New York and London and all of these sort of big cities around the world. But I don't think that there's anything different with how we operate in Australia and in Melbourne. And, the city life is the same here as it is everywhere else.
Yeah.
It's a crazy pace. I think I'd like to jump into the work that you're doing now. So we've referenced it a few times. I guess take us through New Urban Governance. We've talked about, some of the workshops you've had and the power of narrative, but would love to understand, I guess, the full piece of work and maybe any bits we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, that sounds good. So, as I said, it evolved out of our work on Participatory Melbourne last year. Really it was diving deeper into some of those insights that just really felt prominent and felt that we could actually dig deeper and understand how we might shift some things to create new paths for participation and to unlock what that actually means. And so earlier this year, we kind of took those insights. We did quite a big, broad literature review, looking at all the different ways that some of those themes were being explored and interrogated, not just in Australia or in Melbourne, but actually around the world. And we recognised that enabling conditions was something that could be really tangible as almost like an offering or a support to work that's already existing, because we felt that there is a lot of things happening. But as we spoke about earlier, there's also a lot of things that are getting in the way of that and that aren't creating the enabling conditions for a thriving city or a safe and just space if we talk about the work we're doing around the broader donut. And so from that, we recognised 3 key areas that we wanted to inquire deeper and do some experimentation around, because we felt that they could really unlock more opportunities and more, more readily enable great work that's already happening, but also provide demonstrations of what is possible that other, communities or people or places could actually look at. And so new narratives was definitely the first one, and really understanding, as I said earlier, both what are new narratives that communities are wanting to get behind, but also what is the role of narrative in actually supporting communities in changing and taking action with regards to their places. And then the next one, which is quite connected, is looking at what are the new forms of leadership that need to be supported to actually help us with this transition. And so we use leadership because it's a term that people are familiar with. But I think often when we use that term, it very quickly becomes a title. And so for us, this exploration wasn't leadership with a title. It wasn't the capital L leadership. It's actually the leadership that we all engage in every day as people in a place trying to do our best to contribute. And so it was a recognition that our current systems of governance have different layers of governing and different people leading in those different aspects. But actually, there's an untapped community or urban layer that we felt, and what we were seeing through all the research, wasn't effectively influencing and being able to tap into that broader system of governance. And if we look at some of the data that's showing that people don't feel like their voices are being represented in our institutions and in our government system, maybe this is why. Maybe this is an opportunity to recognise actually we've got people leading every day in their places and they aren't being given the support and the structures they need to actually do that effectively. And so the new forms of leadership is not to say that we're creating a new type of leadership. I'm not going to say that, from transformative leadership, we're moving into something else, or adaptive leadership. No, this isn't a new theory. This is actually recognizing, and I suppose what we've been doing this year is spending time to begin with across our projects, because obviously we observe communities around the river, we observe communities on the streets, and we observe communities in food systems. There are 3 Earthshot areas of focus, our 3 projects. And so we started by exploring, well, who are those leaders, lowercase l, not titles, that are popping up in these different contexts? How are they working together? How are they enabling transition or change? And in some instances, how are they creating a vision for the future, and how are they able to imagine something different than what already exists? And from that work, we've been starting to explore a potential set of tools or a contribution that might be able to tap into that level of urban governance that isn't given enough structure and support in its current form. And so what we're looking at there is archetypes as a starting point to help us almost surface these people that already exist, but also recognizing that there are so many people playing multiple roles in contributing to their place, into leading in their own different ways. And so this was almost an effort to also show all of the different combinations of activity and contribution that are happening in order to, I suppose, both protect and transform and progress action at a community level. And so then the last area that we've been looking at is then looking... Oh, yeah.
Just make a comment. Just on archetypes, it's interesting. As you were saying it, I was just thinking that maybe that's another factor into people's unsureness of how they participate, is they don't actually know what role they are naturally born to play in, and also what role they should. Maybe they think they have to do X where they really just need to do Y, or, it can be confusing as to how your leadership actually shows up in these sort of ways. So I think that's a really, fascinating way to approach this, is to look at these archetypes and have people relate to these different skills and things that they need, the support as well, and how that sort of interplays. Because I think narrowing down on what your role or your leadership style is quite difficult, as we're talking about these different things. And so I'm just wondering, have you seen, I guess this archetypes must be pretty new, right? Have you tested it much yet? So they're fresh.
They're fresh. So like I said, we developed them through our projects. And so our conveners of each project kind of were very helpful in surfacing some of those examples and, then having conversations with some of those different people. And then we wanted to look obviously outside of our realms. And so some of the workshops that we've been running more recently have been actually putting these out in the world. I mean, this is what we're seeing. Do these resonate with you? Do you see examples of these in your community? Or if these don't resonate, are they at least helpful to help you start identifying some of the different roles that you're seeing that might, help identify how movement or change happens in your places? They are fresh. They're very much being tested. And this year was definitely a year of experimentation. And I think, that kind of a really interesting part of the systems lab that we've established. It's only new as well. But the idea is that we can be diagnosing and lifting things out of the different work that we're doing, and then almost dive deeper into those specifics that might be contributing to those enabling conditions that allow things to change and happen, but also then experimenting with different ways of potentially engaging with those. And so this is a really good example in our Regen Streets work. I've been doing a lot of work with Nina around the different sites that we have and the different groups that she's engaging with and, different parts across Greater Melbourne and the different players. And we just kept coming back to this conversation around there's just these amazing community leaders who wouldn't even call themselves that, but they are doing so much to actually support and create change or create transition in their places to, drive regeneration, that we need to do something with this. Like there's clearly something here that is untapped. And so, then being able to say, okay, well, let's focus on that. What does it mean to be a community leader? And then the experiment is these archetypes to actually look at, is this helpful? Can we pull something together from what we're seeing and almost give it back to communities and say, does this feel right? Is it helpful for you? As you said, it was actually quite a nice validation moment just there that you kind of felt that there was a use to them, because that's really what we're trying to look at. Can we create things and surface things that are useful to then help, communities take action further or to scale what they're doing or to explore different pathways for doing things that they're doing. So yeah, fresh, experimental is definitely the vibe.
Yeah. I think, even for me to just look at the different archetypes and just think, I resonate with this, I don't resonate with this, I feel like my skills go there, was a really interesting journey for me and something that I want to continue looking at. I think it's a really potent way of looking at this, and I'm sure it'll help, if we're talking about service design, it just helps you make these services and help these archetypes out in the work that they're doing. Was there an archetype that you resonated with the most?
I would say that I sit across a few, and I think it depends on what hat I'm wearing. One of the ones that came out was the nurturer. So it's that person who helps bring people in regardless of where they come from and helps them land and helps them feel safe and comfortable, that helps them almost better understand themselves and their potential and be able to unlock that. I feel like I just end up being in that position. And I think it's been really interesting in my different contexts. That one tends to stick around. So if I think of the work I'm doing at the uni, I tend to not just teach, but I almost feel like it's my job to actually help unlock the potential of these amazing students and these amazing people who are coming through the university, but also to help them feel that sense of this is a safe place to try things, but actually let's try things. So I think that's one. And then sometimes I think I'm a bit of a mobilizer. I'm kind of cool, we've been talking a lot, let's make stuff happen. And connecting the dots, being I know this person and I know that person, and let's bring them together and let's just give this a go, which is maybe why I'm sitting in an experimental role now that I think about it. But yeah, I would say a combination of those two definitely, feels right at this point in time. And I think that's a good point. It's not like personality tests and your Myers-Briggs and all of that, where you're just I'm in a box and this is who I am. It's more of actually, this is what I'm gravitating to right now. Or this is where potentially I could lean into to help me navigate this different situation. And if we think about communities, everyone's at a different point in that change journey. And, we even spoke about that, actually recognizing, where is your community at? Are they at the really early stages of recognizing that something needs to shift, or that maybe they want a new vision for the place or for what, you are capable of doing or wanting to do? Or are you at the end of implementing and it's we're clear, we know where we want to go and we just now need to make it happen? It's also interesting recognizing that and then thinking about what are the archetypes that are actually going to support those different moments, or what are the different skills we're leveraging from those archetypes at different stages.
Yeah, it's interesting that this conversation has happened at kind of a perfect time for me, because I've been thinking a lot about participation and community activation, and that was the intention behind putting all of these questions out to the listeners. So it was around 10 questions, and just trying to understand where they're at, where are we all at, what are we thinking about, how do we feel we can participate. And for me, that's the next step. Is I want to take all of the inputs from that and try and understand, okay, how do I actually implement this into action now? And what are the different things I can, host or run or try and collaborate to really, because people are interested in doing the work, at least, the community that I engage with. So yeah, this conversation already has been very helpful and insightful. Before I interrupted you, you were talking about the third part of new urban governance. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I've been very busy. I feel like when I talk about this, I'm like, wow, there's a lot here. But yeah, it's the third area that I've been experimenting in is looking at what are new mechanisms that might actually support a new wave of urban governance. And one of the things that, anyone who works in a community organisation or not-for-profit has experienced, which is resource constraint and capital flow, and knowing what you need to do and having the people to do it, but not having the resource or having the funding. And so one of the things that we wanted to look at is if we've got clear narrative that is driving direction and we've got great people and leaders who have certain abilities to engage or understanding of their community, what would it look like to then start interrogating some of the mechanisms that might provide that resource and allow communities to make decisions about the things that they want to be doing and freely then move into action without having to constantly be asking for grants or for money or finding ways to resource that. And so this third area is really looking at how do we better understand a different engagement with democratic processes that distributes decision-making, but also that builds higher trust relationships so that capital can flow more freely. And so what we've been engaging with is a tool, it's called the Wellbeing Protocol, that actually provides a mechanism that allows communities to feed their ideas in, that allows them to vote on those ideas, and it uses a really interesting voting mechanism that actually supports that to be balanced. But also that creates a relationship with the funder where rather than saying, okay, here's the ideas, now here's our proposal, cool, now give us funding, it's actually saying, well, no, let's agree on, it's called a constitution in this tool, but let's agree on a shared purpose or the outcomes that we want to achieve for this community or for a particular theme or issue that we want to tackle. Let's agree on that and let's put some funding to that and put it into a pool and allow the community to then decide what is done with that funding based on what they know their needs are, based on what they know is required to deliver those outcomes in their place.
Wow.
And then give an opportunity for them to tell those stories of what change it made, what benefits it had, which is helpful for those funders to actually understand the impact that they're having. But also it's doing it incrementally. I don't know about you, but end of year impact reports are hard work. And I don't know if you've ever done that, but it takes a lot of effort and it's really hard to look back and generate all of those things. And there's a lot of data that you have to work through. Whereas this is essentially creating that more incremental, ongoing relationship, but also that feeding through of what is this, what change is this actually creating? And how can we be learning from this together and have that trust that what we really care about is the outcomes around this issue or this community, that we can then trust that the people who are closest to those and who have the skills and abilities to tackle those can actually make decisions about them and make them happen. So obviously this is a tool, and it's not to say that this is the tool that needs to navigate everything, But the experiment is actually looking at, can we demonstrate a different way of having those relationships in terms of resource flow or capital flow or funding? But also, can we experiment with what that looks like when it's done in a decentralized or distributed way so that the collective can actually be the voice that's deciding what happens in their place? And then simultaneously, it means that they are also taking accountability and ownership for making that happen. Rather than waiting, asking for permission, getting an approval that, yes, this is the right thing for your community, even though I'm sitting in a completely different place and I've never been to your town or your community or whatever it might be. And then potentially not having that happen because there was a lack of understanding or a lack of engagement with that particular community, or having to wait so long that the issues actually become much bigger and, we've moved on from that. It's a really interesting area to explore. And so I think it really surfaces like our desire to not just engage with things at a grassroots level, but also recognize what are some of the ways that we can support organizations at the grassroots or at the front line to actually test things that could then influence the broader system. And so right now, obviously, we're experimenting. Is this a mechanism that we can play with? And we're engaging with a few different community groups in different places, but also who have or are wanting to have different relationships with different types of funders, and are looking at different issues to see if that is helpful. And if it is helpful, how do we then work with them to look at, well, how do we then start to influence the system to make this something that is a reality for more communities and is something that we consider as part of our urban governance mechanisms, as opposed to just having the traditional grant-making processes that already exist.
That sounds amazing. But seriously, wow.
It's very early stages as well. We are just experimenting, but that is something that we're trying to crack into.
Are there any, similar tools or structures that you've, taken inspiration from or noted in other communities or countries like this sort of grassroots democratic movement of, funds upstream it's amazing.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So first of all, this tool is actually developed in New Zealand and has already had trials in New Zealand and the UK. We've kind of said that we'll give it a go here in Australia and test it in a few areas given the work that we're doing. And so I think it's a really good point that it is an example of a tool. I think there's some other community-generated tools that are also really interesting and I think provide an opportunity to have different relationships with money and with the provision of money and how we engage with money. So one of the groups that I've worked with in my social enterprise space is an organization called Roundtable, and they're also a digital tool, but they're drawing on the principles of similar idea, having a collective pool of shared funds, but it's actually amongst peers, amongst people. So it started out of student movement that students weren't able to pay for things like, big expenses like a big bulk amount of textbooks or a service for a car or, having to have other big investments that they've needed. And this roundtable idea was essentially lifting something that was happening quite organically in this example was in African communities, for example, where that's something that often happens, that communities will share funds together and anyone in that group can access them. And it's a high trust environment where obviously they set parameters as a group to say this is what it can be used for, this is what it can't be used for. And there's a system in terms of understanding how often you can draw from it. But this tool is essentially building from that to essentially create almost those community partnerships and funds at a smaller scale. So obviously you can take loans, you can do all of those things, but sometimes the amount you need is more than you can afford. but is it worth getting into, those debt streams, or, you may not have access to some of those grants or whatever it might be. And so it was a really interesting way, again, coming from a grassroots level of saying, let's build a different relationship with our money, to say we will all contribute a small portion when we can, and then we will actually together use those funds as needed and decide as a community based on our agreement and how we want to support each other, how and when each of us can kind of engage and support each other at key moments in time. And so it's less about being like, oh, my bank balance is really struggling, and actually our community has a bank balance that can support us in different times, because we all have challenges at different points in times in our life. It's a different example, and it's a bit more simple. But again, it's that idea of collective decision-making, recognizing a high-trust environment is possible if we are clear and create structures and agreements and focus on outcomes and values. And also can be something that doesn't need to sit in a big institution. And I think that's where, circling back to our enablers, that's where technology can play an interesting role, particularly as we move into things like blockchain and ledger technologies that actually allow us to validate some of those trust elements in there, which is, part of the path that Wellbeing Protocol is looking to take. I think that is a really interesting use and leveraging of technologies to support a social solution.
Yeah, I mean, being on the blockchain and having a decentralized democratic funding approach for local communities is just, to me, that seems like such a, not obvious, but such a potentially powerful tool that we can leverage. And I think it really feeds what I'm seeing, a trend amongst all of the work that you're doing here at Regen Melbourne. It all ties together quite nicely. And, the story of community and narratives and building leadership types and having roles and then looking to action within a community as well, I think is such a, it really plays well into each other. And I was wondering, for the work that you're doing, are there any significant milestones or timelines around the work that you're doing right now as well?
Yeah, so this year has definitely been a year of taking all of the insights from and sense making from participatory Melbourne, and then the further urban governance exploration, and turning them into experiments that can test some of these, I suppose, hypotheses, like is the easiest way of thinking about it, like some of these inquiries, hypotheses, curiosities that we have. And I think next year, I suppose the first milestone is actually bringing that together. And so I'm working on a consolidation of what we've learnt this year across those three areas. And then moving into next year, actually looking at what will it look like to actually move those beyond experiments and actually look at how does that weave into the different bits of work that we're doing. I think it's really exciting, that we have the river, which is a very different sandpit, I suppose, to streets, which is a very different sandpit to food systems, but also they're all interconnected. And so being able to have that opportunity to experiment, but then actually take that action further and, almost explore bigger scale demonstrations of what that could look like is really exciting. I think that's definitely on the cards for next year. And I'm working really hard right now to pull all of that together so that I can sit with, where we've landed and have those things to share back as well. Obviously, there's been so many people on this journey in these experiments. As you already know, Regen's very much an engine for collaboration. It's not our work, it's the city's work. It's a collaborative effort. And so I think it's also being able to share these things back, to say, have a play and see if this works in your community. And so I think next year is very much action oriented and trying these things maybe at a bigger scale or in a few more different places or different contexts, and really pushing the testing of them and exploring what else they unlock. Because I think from even if we start with a mechanisms perspective, the Wellbeing Protocol and this concept of unlocking capital flows is just one. But through the work that we're doing, on the streets or in the river or in the food systems, there are other mechanisms that we need to poke and prod that actually create more of those enabling conditions. And so I think what this has done is it's created almost a way, an approach for us to explore these different categories, I suppose, or these areas of inquiry and try them in different ways. What might mechanisms look like in the food system and which ones need to be changed there? Or what does it look like to support certain archetypes in the context of the river, particularly given all of the governance layers that exist, in how that river actually exists and operates and what is allowed to be done and what might it look like to actually instill a different layer of urban governance in a very complex and full system already.
Mm-hmm. Final question from me. For anybody that is interested in participating in the work that Regen Melbourne is doing, or I guess to what we've been speaking about, even more broadly around participating. So I guess this is a two-part question. How should people contact you? How can they get involved? What should they be on the lookout for? How can people contribute?
Cool. Yes. And actually that has prompted me to also mention that next year a lot of the work that we're doing is actually really trying to weave our different pieces of work together. And so I think in terms of participation, I think there are lots of different pathways in because of that. So the easiest way to have a look at what's happening and where our work is at is the Regen Gazette. It's on our website, but also you can access it through a mailing list. So our website's just regen.melbourne. And in the news section, we've got our Regen Gazette, which has a whole bunch of write-ups and blogs and field notes where we're sharing actually where the work is at and how it's progressing and the things we're navigating as we're going. So our team is very open in terms of sharing those things and wanting to help people really feel and experience the work and see the incremental things that we're exploring. So I think that's one pathway. We do often host or co-host events. And so, again, our website has a section where you can see what's happening. We run them quite often because for us, engaging with our community and with our alliance is a really important way for us to actually be in touch with what's happening in the different parts of the city and in the different overlapping areas. And so that is definitely another thing that we do. And sometimes our events are more come along and watch a thing or hear a thing. And then sometimes they're actually really interactive. Like one of the events we had earlier this year was playing board games to understand adaptation or, being part of a yarning circle to talk about Indigenous wisdom in the forms of regeneration. And what does that look like? And how do we have those conversations? So there's lots of different elements. And then specifically on the work, if any of the areas I've spoken about are interested in terms of the work that people are doing or wanting to do, then we're always open to having conversations about collaborations. And so either reaching out to me at caroline@regen.melbourne or hello@regen.melbourne. We are more than happy to have a conversation and explore collaborations because that's what we do.
I'll link everything that Caroline just mentioned there, and I can firsthand speak to the Regen Melbourne events being a lot of fun, and you get to meet cool and interesting people and stick stuff on boards and have a play. I really enjoy how you guys collaborate, and I will. Every time there's a Regen Melbourne, I make sure to shout it out. But to anybody that's looking to participate, as Caroline mentioned, there's plenty of opportunity. So if you feel like you want to participate, and we've spoken a lot about participation on this episode, but there is opportunity to get involved. And I think even surfacing that to the level is such an important part of this journey that we're going to have to take collectively. And
Definitely.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed that conversation. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to meeting in person and hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody.